The Ton called him the monster of Mayfair. Half his face was ruined by Waterloo grapeshot, the other half by a scowl that could freeze gin. He was a duke, rich as Croesus, and completely untouchable. Nobody looked him in the eye, nobody except her. She didn't want a fairy tale, she wanted to survive. When he cornered her in the shadows, expecting her to run, she did the unthinkable. She stepped closer. The ballroom at Cavendish House smelled of wilting gardenias, hot wax, and the desperate sweat of 100 marriageable daughters. Cecilia stood near a marble pillar, perfectly still, letting the silk of the curtains brush her shoulder. She was 25. In the eyes of the Ton, she was practically a relic, a ghost haunting the fringes of the dance floor. Her gown was 3 seasons old, the pale blue dye fading to a dull grey near the hem. She didn't mind. Being invisible had its uses. It meant she didn't have to smile at simpering viscounts or pretend to care about the latest parliamentary debates. She took a sip of the lemonade. It was warm and entirely too tart. Then the music faltered. It wasn't a sudden stop. The violinists just lost their timing, one by one, as the crowd near the grand double doors parted. A profound, unnatural silence rippled through the room, broken only by a rhythmic, heavy sound. Thwack, step, thwack, step. Alistair, the Duke of Rothgate, was not a man who entered a room. He invaded it. He leaned heavily on a blackthorn cane. His broad shoulders were rigid under a severely cut, black evening coat, devoid of the usual foppish embroidery. Cecilia watched him over the rim of her glass. She had heard the rumours, of course. Everyone had. 5 years ago, an artillery shell in Belgium had ripped through his cavalry unit. He had survived. The men standing next to him had not. As he limped forward, the crowd shrank back. They didn't just make way, they recoiled. Women raised fans to their faces. Men suddenly found the painted ceiling fascinating. Alistair ignored them. He kept his head tilted slightly downward, the right side of his face obscured by the collar of his coat and the fall of thick, dark hair. He didn't stay long in the main hall. He cut a straight path toward the library corridors, seeking the dark. Cecilia set her glass down. Her feet throbbed in her pinched satin slippers. The air in the ballroom was thick enough to chew. A quiet library sounded like heaven. She waited 3 minutes, then slipped past the dowagers and out the side door. The library was cavernous, lit only by the dying embers in a massive stone hearth. Cecilia closed the heavy oak door behind her, exhaling a long breath, finally allowing her shoulders to slump. "The room is occupied." The voice was a harsh rasp, like dry leaves scraping over stone. Cecilia froze. She squinted into the gloom. Alistair was sitting in a high-backed leather chair by the window, a crystal decanter in one hand, a half-empty glass in the other. He didn't look at her. "My apologies, Your Grace," she said, her voice steady. She didn't move towards the door. "I only sought a moment's reprieve from the heat. Find another room." Cecilia felt a spark of irritation. She was tired, she was poor, and she was out of patience for titled men throwing tantrums. "The house has 70 rooms. I am taking up roughly 2 square feet of this one. I promise not to breathe too loudly." Alistair stopped pouring. He set the decanter down with a sharp clink. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Slowly he pushed himself up from the chair. He leaned on his cane, turning to face her fully. He stepped out of the shadows and into the dim orange glow of the hearth. He did it on purpose. It was a test, a weapon. The left side of his face was a ruin. The skin was puckered and violently shiny, a landscape of jagged, melted scars that pulled the corner of his eye downward and distorted his jawline. It was a brutal, unforgiving injury. It looked like it still hurt. He stared at her, waiting for the gasp, waiting for the flinch, waiting for her to avert her eyes or run crying back to the safety of the perfumed crowd. Cecilia didn't move. She didn't gasp. She looked at his face, taking in the reality of the damage. And then she met his good right eye. It was a startling pale grey. His jaw tightened. He took a step towards her, his immense height casting a long, crooked shadow across the Persian rug. He leaned in, the scent of expensive brandy and cold rain clinging to his coat. "Don't pretend you're afraid of me," he whispered. The hostility in his voice was a thin cover for something much deeper. Cecilia looked at the heavy silver head of his cane, then back up to his face. She unlaced her hands from in front of her waist. She stepped closer. The Duke inhaled sharply, stepping back a fraction of an inch before he caught himself. "I am not pretending," Cecilia said quietly. "I am terrified of poverty. I am terrified of dying of a simple fever because I cannot afford a doctor. I am terrified of my aunt's endless weeping lectures." She held his gaze, her expression entirely serious. "I am not terrified of a scar, Your Grace. It is frankly none of my business." Alistair stared at her. The muscle in his good cheek feathered. He looked her up and down, really seeing her for the first time. The faded dress, the resolute jut of her chin, the exhaustion shadowing her eyes. "Who are you?" he asked. The rasp in his voice was gone, replaced by a quiet, demanding curiosity. "Cecilia North," she replied. She gave a perfectly executed, entirely cynical curtsy. And I will leave you to your brandy now, Your Grace." She turned and walked out of the library, leaving the Duke of Rothgate standing alone in the dark, watching the door long after she had gone. The rented townhouse on Half Moon Street smelled of boiled cabbage and damp wool. Cecilia sat at the small dining table, meticulously darning a hole in the thumb of her only pair of winter gloves. Across the room, her Aunt Louisa was pacing, a crumpled handkerchief clutched to her chest. 25, Cecilia! 25! Louisa wailed, hitting the same note she had been hitting for 3 years. "Lord Hastings was looking right at you last night, and you vanished. Vanished. We have £40 to our name. When the lease is up next month, we shall be on the street." "Lord Hastings is 72 and drools when he laughs, Aunt," Cecilia said, not looking up from her needlework. "And he was looking at the tray of oysters passing behind me." Before Louisa could launch into a fresh wave of hysterics, a heavy, authoritative knock rattled the thin front door. The maid, a girl they could barely afford to pay, shuffled down the hall. A moment later, the parlour door opened. The maid looked terrified. The Duke of Rothgate, ma'am!" she squeaked, and practically fled the room. Aunt Louisa stopped dead, the handkerchief falling from her hands. She turned white, then a mottled, panicked red. Alistair stepped into the small parlour. He had to duck slightly to clear the doorframe. In the cramped, shabby room, he looked massive. A dark storm cloud trapped in a bird cage. He wore a heavy wool driving coat, gripping his cane with white-knuckled intensity. He did not look at Aunt Louisa. His pale grey eye locked onto Cecilia. "Miss North." Cecilia tied off the thread, snipped it with a small pair of scissors, and stood. "Your Grace, to what do we owe this highly irregular honour?" Alistair glanced around the room. He took in the peeling wallpaper, the cold hearth, and the sheer desperation clinging to the walls. "I require a private word, with you." Louisa let out a choked sound, somewhere between a sob and a gasp of outrage. "A private word?" "Your Grace, my niece is an unmarried gentlewoman." "Aunt Louisa," Cecilia interrupted smoothly. "Please go to the kitchen and see about some tea. I believe His Grace and I can leave the parlour door open a crack to satisfy propriety." Louisa looked from the imposing, scarred giant to her niece, terror winning over duty. She scurried out of the room without another word. Alistair limped to the small floral sofa. He looked at it with deep suspicion before lowering himself onto it. The cheap wood creaked ominously in protest. He rested both hands on his cane, staring at Cecilia. "You are destitute," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a blunt statement of fact. Cecilia sat down in the wooden chair opposite him. "My financial standing is hardly a secret, Your Grace, though I am surprised a duke would concern himself with the ledgers of a spinster. I do not care about your ledgers. I care about your disposition." He leaned forward slightly. The daylight from the window fell mercilessly across the ruined side of his face. He didn't hide it. You did not flinch last night. You did not offer me pity. You looked at me as though I were a man standing in your way, nothing more. You were standing in my way. The absolute faintest ghost of a smirk touched the right side of his mouth. It was gone in an instant. I need a wife. Cecilia's breath hitched, just for a second. She kept her face entirely blank. I imagine a man of your title has mothers throwing their daughters at your feet. They throw their daughters at my bank accounts, he corrected bitterly. And the daughters weep, or tremble, or look at me with that cloying, nauseating sympathy that makes me want to put a bullet in my own head. I will not live with a woman who forces herself to endure my presence. I will not have a terrified child cowering in my halls. So you seek out a destitute spinster, Cecilia said softly. I seek a transaction, Alistair said. His tone was clipped, professional. You require money and security. I require respectability, someone to manage the sprawling nightmare of my estates, and eventually, an heir. He swallowed hard on the last word, looking away for a fraction of a second before meeting her gaze again. It will be a marriage in name and law only, save for what is strictly necessary to produce a child. I will not demand your affection. I will not demand your companionship outside of social obligations. Cecilia folded her hands in her lap. Her mind was racing, calculating, weighing the brutal honesty of the man against the terrifying reality of her empty purse. What are your terms? She asked. Alistair blinked, clearly taken aback by her immediate pivot to logistics. £10,000 settled upon you immediately. A personal allowance of £5,000 a year. You will have your own wing at Oakhaven. Your aunt will be provided a cottage on the estate grounds and a comfortable stipend. It was a staggering fortune. It was freedom, wrapped in an ironclad contract with a haunted man. I will manage the estate accounts, Cecilia countered. I will not be a figurehead. If I am to be the Duchess of Rothgate, I will actually run the household. Agreed. The current steward is an incompetent fool anyway. And if we do not produce an heir? She asked. The words felt heavy, awkward, but necessary. Then my insufferable cousin inherits, and you remain a very wealthy widow when I die. He replied smoothly. Cecilia looked at him. The tension in his shoulders was immense. He was a man holding himself together by sheer force of will, waiting for the rejection he had come to expect from the world. She stood up. She walked across the small space between them and extended her right hand. I accept your proposal, Your Grace. Alistair looked at her small, bare hand. Slowly he reached out. He wore no gloves. The tips of his pinky and ring finger on his left hand were missing. His grip was rough, calloused, and surprisingly warm. We leave for Oakhaven the day after the ceremony, he said, holding her hand a second longer than strictly necessary. Do not expect a fairy tale, Miss North. I told you last night, Your Grace, Cecilia said, pulling her hand back. I stopped believing in fairies a very long time ago. The carriage ride to Yorkshire was a brutal endurance test. It rained for 3 days straight, a relentless, freezing deluge that turned the rutted roads into a river of mud. They barely spoke. Alistair sat in the opposite corner of the carriage, his long legs stretched out stiffly across the floorboards. He spent hours staring out the window at the grey landscape, his face closed off. Cecilia spent the time reading a volume on agricultural crop rotation she had purchased in London. If she was going to run an estate, she would not do it blindly. When Oakhaven finally loomed into view, it matched the weather. It was a massive, sprawling Tudor beast of a house, built of dark stone. It didn't look romantic or Gothic. It just looked immensely cold. As the carriage pulled into the courtyard, a meagre line of servants stood waiting in the drizzle. They looked anxious, their eyes darting nervously towards the carriage door. Alistair stepped out first. The wet cobblestones were slippery. His cane slipped. He stumbled, catching himself hard against the carriage wheel with a muffled grunt of pain. A footman darted forward to help. "Get back!" Alistair snapped, his voice echoing sharply in the damp courtyard. The footman scrambled backward, terrified. Cecilia stepped out smoothly, ignoring the footman's offered hand, and stood beside her new husband. "The stone is slick with moss, Your Grace," she said loudly, her tone mild and conversational. Someone ought to have had the courtyard scrubbed. She looked pointedly at the shivering steward standing at the front of the line. The man swallowed hard. Alistair shot her a sideways glance, righted himself, and began the slow, agonizing walk up the wide stone steps. "Welcome to Oakhaven, madam," he muttered under his breath. Inside, the abbey smelled of wood smoke, old dust, and damp hounds. The ceilings were impossibly high, making the rooms impossible to heat. Everything was immaculate, but entirely lifeless. It felt less like a home and more like a museum dedicated to a dead family. They were shown to their separate wings. Cecilia's rooms were vast, decorated in heavy red velvet that looked as though it hadn't been changed since the reign of King James. Dinner that night was an exercise in silence. They sat at opposite ends of a mahogany table that could easily seat 30. The only sounds were the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall and the quiet scrape of silver on porcelain. Over the next week, Cecilia went to work. She didn't try to charm her husband or coax him out of his shell. She simply occupied the space he had given her. She demanded the estate ledgers. The steward, a Mr. Finchley, tried to deny her, citing that it was men's business. Cecilia fired him before lunch. When she finally got her hands on the books, she found the truth. Alistair was not a cruel landlord, but an absent one. The numbers were balanced perfectly, but they lacked context. He approved funds for road repairs, but the tenants' roofs were caving in. He bought prime cattle, but the village schoolhouse had no coal. He managed the estate like a military campaign, efficient, bloodless, and entirely detached. On her 10th evening at Oakhaven, Cecilia found him in his study. The room was practically a cave, lit by a single lamp on his desk. He was rubbing his bad leg, his head thrown back against his leather chair, eyes closed in pain. She knocked sharply on the open door frame. Alistair's head snapped up. His hand dropped from his leg, his posture immediately snapping into rigid defense. "What is it?" he demanded. Cecilia walked in and dropped a heavy ledger onto his desk. The loud thump made him blink. "We are bleeding money on the Eastern Tenant Farms," she said, pulling a chair up to his desk and sitting down without being asked. "Because you approved a switch to wheat 3 years ago, but the soil there is entirely clay. They need to pivot back to root vegetables. Furthermore, the slate on the Miller cottages is rotten. They are freezing." Alistair stared at her. He looked at the ledger, then back to her face. He was used to people coming to him with apologies, with fear, or not at all. He wasn't used to a small woman in a plain brown dress lecturing him on root vegetables. Finchley reported the Eastern farms were simply suffering a string of bad luck. Alistair said, his voice low. "Finchley is an idiot who wouldn't know clay soil if he ate it." Cecilia replied flatly. "I authorized the purchase of new slate today. It will cost £300. I expect you to sign off on the draft." She pushed a piece of paper and a pen toward him. Alistair looked down at the paper. A strange, completely unreadable expression crossed his ruined face. He picked up the pen, dipped it in ink, and signed his name in sharp, aggressive strokes. "Is there anything else, madam?" he asked, a hint of dry sarcasm creeping into his voice. "Yes," Cecilia said. She stood up. She looked at his leg, then at the dead fire in his grate. "The chimneys in this wing are choked with soot. It is freezing in here. If you expect me to work in this house, I require warmth. I will have the sweeps here tomorrow." Before he could argue, she turned and walked out. An hour later, as Alistair sat staring at the signed draft, a maid scurried into the room, keeping her eyes firmly on the floor. She placed a heavy object wrapped in thick flannel by his feet, curtsied hurriedly, and fled. Alistair looked down. It was a heated brick, radiating intense, glorious warmth into the freezing air near the floorboards. He didn't move it. Slowly, cautiously, he extended his bad leg and rested his aching boot against the warm flannel. He sat there in the dark, staring at the empty doorway. A quiet storm brewing behind his pale grey eye. February in Yorkshire did not arrive. It assaulted. It was a month of frozen mud, slate-grey skies, and a wind that felt like a knife dragging against exposed bone. Cecilia spent her mornings in the estate office, a cramped room smelling of damp wool and old parchment. She had replaced the incompetent steward with a young, sharply intelligent clerk from Leeds named Mr. Harrison. Harrison was terrified of Alistair and slightly bewildered by Cecilia, which made him perfectly compliant. Together they ripped apart the estate's ledgers. The reality of Oakhaven was not just neglect, it was isolation. The Duke's refusal to engage with the world meant the world had stopped engaging with Oakhaven. On a particularly bitter Tuesday, Cecilia ordered the carriage brought round. She did not ask Alistair's permission. She bundled herself in a heavy wool pelisse, tied a stark, unadorned bonnet under her chin, and directed the driver to the village of Highfield, the largest settlement on the Duke's land. The village square was a depressing collection of leaning timber frames and muddy ruts. As the ducal carriage stopped in front of the blacksmith's forge, the steady ringing of the hammer ceased. The silence that followed was heavy, watchful, and intensely suspicious. Cecilia stepped down into the muck. She didn't lift her skirts to protect the hem. She walked straight to the forge, where a massive, soot-stained man stood holding a pair of tongs. "You are Mr. Cobb," she said, raising her voice over the hiss of the forge fire. "You hold the lease on the timber mill near the river." The blacksmith stared at her, then spat a dark stream of tobacco juice into the ashes. "I hold the lease from His Grace, not his wife. His Grace is occupied," Cecilia said, her voice flat, devoid of any aristocratic lilt. "I am reviewing the mill's output. You have fallen behind on your quota for the estate repairs for 3 consecutive months. The tenant cottages are waiting on roof beams." A low murmur rippled through the small crowd gathering in the square. A man in a moderately tailored broadcloth coat pushed his way to the front. He had the ruddy, overfed look of a local authority. "Your Grace," the man said, offering a mocking bow. "I am Magistrate Gable." Cecilia held up a gloved hand. "I did not ask for a magistrate. I am speaking to my blacksmith about my timber." The magistrate flushed a dark, angry purple. "The Duke does not send women to handle his disputes. Mr. Cobb's mill is suffering because the river froze early, and he cannot afford the extra hands to move the logs by wagon. If the Duke wishes to evict him, let the scarred devil come down here and do it himself, rather than hiding in his abbey." The crowd went dead silent. The insult hung in the freezing air, sharp and dangerous. Cecilia looked at the magistrate. She felt a cold, hard knot form in her stomach, but she kept her face entirely still. She was calculating how to dismantle the man without a public screaming match when a sound broke the silence. Thwack, step, thwack, step. The rhythm was unmistakable. It came from the stone bridge leading into the village. Alistair was walking down the muddy incline. He was not wearing his heavy driving coat, only a stark black riding jacket that offered no protection against the biting wind. He leaned heavily on his blackthorn cane, his limp pronounced, his face a pale, furious mask. The crowd parted fast enough to trample each other. He didn't look at the villagers. He didn't look at the blacksmith. He walked directly to Cecilia, stopping a mere foot away from her. The left side of his face was flushed red from the cold, making the jagged, silvery scar tissue stand out in violent relief. He turned his head slowly, fixing his good, pale grey eye on the magistrate. "Repeat what you just said," Alistair ordered. His voice was not loud. It was a raspy, gravelly whisper that carried perfectly in the terrified silence. The magistrate lost his ruddy colour, turning the shade of old oatmeal. "Your Grace, I merely meant that Her Grace should not be burdened with the crude matters of—" You called me a scarred devil, Alistair said. He took a single, agonizing step closer to the man. And you implied my wife was a shield to hide behind. The magistrate opened his mouth, but no sound came out. My wife, Alistair said, his voice dropping another octave, speaks with my absolute authority. When she demands an accounting of the timber, she is my voice. When she demands the roof beams for the tenant cottages, she is my hand. He leaned heavily on his cane, the knuckles of his right hand white. If you ever disrespect her in this village again, I will not evict you. I will buy the debt on this miserable patch of mud you call a jurisdiction, and I will raze it to the ground. Do we understand one another? The magistrate nodded frantically, his chin trembling. Alistair turned his gaze to the blacksmith. The river is frozen. Hire the wagons. The estate will cover the cost of the extra men. Have the timber at the cottages by Friday. He didn't wait for an answer. He turned his back on the crowd, looked at Cecilia, and gave a sharp jerk of his head toward the carriage. They rode back in silence. The cold inside the carriage was absolute. Alistair was shivering slightly, his jaw clamped shut so tight the muscles twitched. He kept rubbing his ruined thigh with his left hand, staring blindly out the window. You did not have to follow me, Cecilia said softly, staring at her ruined hem. You are my wife, he rasped, not looking at her. They will respect you, or they will fear you. The method does not matter to me, but the result is mandatory. Your leg is worse in the cold. It is none of your concern. It is my concern when you risk pneumonia to play the terrifying overlord in a mud puddle. She shot back. He finally looked at her. The hostility in his eye was warring with something else, a deep, exhausting pain. I told you I needed a wife to manage this place. I did not tell you to fight my battles. I wasn't fighting your battle, Cecilia said, her voice steady. I was fighting for the roof beams. You just happened to get in the way. Alistair stared at her for a long moment. Slowly, he leaned his head back against the velvet squabs and closed his eyes. Friday, he muttered. If Cobb doesn't have the timber there by Friday, you have my permission to fire him. Cecilia looked at the tense lines of his face, the way his breath hitched slightly with every bump of the carriage. She reached onto the opposite seat, grabbed a thick woolen traveling blanket, and threw it roughly over his lap. He opened his eye, glaring at her. Don't flatter yourself, she said, looking out her own window. If you freeze to death, the estate reverts to your cousin, and I refuse to share a house with him. Alistair didn't throw the blanket off. He pulled it slightly higher, his grip tight on the wool. The invitation sat on the breakfast table like a bomb waiting to detonate. It was thick, cream-colored vellum, bordered in gold leaf. Lord and Lady Harrington were hosting a dinner for the local gentry at their estate, 10 miles south of Oakhaven. Alistair stared at it over the rim of his teacup. He looked as though he wanted to set it on fire. We are not going. Cecilia buttered a piece of toast with meticulous care. We are going. The Harringtons are the largest landowners in the county after you. You have ignored them for 5 years. They think you are a madman who tortures hounds in the cellar. Let them think it. I will not manage a social pariah's estate, Cecilia said, taking a bite of her toast. We need alliances. We need the local magistrates on our side when it comes to the new toll roads. We are going, Alistair. It was the first time she had used his Christian name. The word seemed to echo in the cavernous dining room. He lowered his teacup slowly. He looked at her, his expression entirely guarded. They will stare, he said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. It was a statement of fact, brutal and raw. Yes, she agreed simply. They will. And then they will eat their soup, because staring doesn't fill the stomach. He laughed. It was a harsh, rust-dry sound that held no humor. You are remarkably callous, Cecilia. I am practical. We leave at 6. The Harrington dining room was a blinding display of excessive wealth. 30 guests sat around a table groaning under the weight of silver candelabras and hothouse flowers. When Alistair and Cecilia entered, The reaction was exactly as predicted. The polite chatter died a sudden, violent death. Forks were lowered. Eyes darted towards the doorway, snagged on Alistair's ruined face, and quickly dropped to the tablecloth. Alistair's posture was rigid, his grip on his cane white-knuckled. He looked like a soldier preparing to walk into a firing squad. Cecilia stepped smoothly to his right side, the side of his good eye. She rested her hand lightly on his forearm. She didn't grip him. She just anchored him. "Shoulders back, Your Grace," she murmured, her voice too low for anyone else to hear. "They are entirely beneath our notice." The dinner was an agonizing marathon of forced politeness. Alistair was seated near the hostess, Cecilia further down the table. She watched him covertly. He barely ate. He answered questions in clipped monosyllabic grunts. Lady Harrington, to her credit, tried to maintain a conversation, but the sheer force of Alistair's defensive hostility shut her down. Across from Cecilia sat Lord Linwood, a sneering, overly powdered man who had lost out on purchasing prime grazing land to Alistair's estate managers years ago. "Tell me, Your Grace," Lord Linwood called out, his voice cutting through the quiet murmur of the table. He was looking directly at Alistair. "How do you find the Yorkshire air after your extensive time on the continent? I imagine it is quite a change of pace from the excitements of military life." The table went dead still. Everyone knew Alistair had not left his estate since returning from Belgium. The question was a deliberate, cruel barb, poking directly at the 5 years of reclusive hiding. Alistair's jaw locked. His hand tightened around his wineglass. He looked at Linwood, the scarred left side of his face catching the flickering candlelight, making the twisted skin look almost demonic. Before Alistair could speak, Cecilia set her silver fork down. It hit the porcelain plate with a sharp clink. "The Duke finds the Yorkshire air remarkably free of foolish questions, Lord Linwood," Cecilia said. Her voice was conversational, pleasant, and utterly lethal. "Though I suppose one must adapt to local pollution from time to time." A collective, silent gasp went around the table. Linwood turned red. "I merely meant, Duchess, that it must be difficult to manage an estate when one is so removed from polite society. My husband manages his estate with a precision you could only dream of," Cecilia replied, taking a sip of her wine. "I reviewed the county yield reports last week. Oakhaven produced 30% more grain than your lands, Linwood. Perhaps if you spent less time concerning yourself with my husband's social calendar and more time inspecting your drainage ditches, your tenants wouldn't be petitioning the Crown for relief." The silence that followed was absolute. Lady Harrington suddenly found her peas fascinating. Lord Linwood looked as though he had been slapped across the face with a wet fish. Cecilia looked down the table at Alistair. He was staring at her. The hostility was gone, replaced by the profound, shocked stillness. The carriage ride home was shrouded in a heavy, suffocating darkness. The rain had started again, drumming a relentless rhythm against the roof. Alistair sat in the gloom, a shadow among shadows. He hadn't spoken since they left the Harrington estate. "You overstepped," he finally said. His voice was rough, scraping against the quiet of the carriage. "I defended the estate's honor," Cecilia said, looking out the window at the pitch-black road. "You defended me. You are the estate. Do not play word games with me, Cecilia." He leaned forward suddenly, invading her space. The scent of brandy and rain-dampened wool filled her lungs. "I do not need a champion. I do not need a woman fighting my battles at a dinner table. I am a monster, not a child." "You are a fool!" Cecilia snapped, turning to face him. In the dim light of the passing carriage lanterns, she could see the raw, exposed nerve in his eye. "You let them treat you like a pariah because you believe you are one. You wear that scar like a punishment you deserve." "It is a punishment!" he roared, slamming his cane onto the floorboards. The crack echoed like a gunshot. "It is a reminder of every man who died in the mud while I was pulled out breathing. Look at it." He grabbed her wrist, his grip painfully tight, and yanked her hand up, pressing her palm flat against the ruined left side of his face. Cecilia gasped, not in horror, but in shock at the sudden violence of the movement. The skin beneath her palm was terribly uneven, rigid with keloid scars, lacking the soft elasticity of human flesh. It was hot, a burning landscape of trauma. He held her hand there, breathing heavily, his chest heaving. He waited for her to scream, to pull away, to cry. Cecilia didn't move. She kept her hand pressed firmly against his cheek. Her pulse raced, hammering in her throat, but she forced her breathing to remain steady. Slowly, deliberately, she moved her thumb, brushing it gently over the jagged ridge near his jawline. Alistair shuddered. A violent, full-bodied tremor racked him, and he dropped her wrist as if she had burned him. He fell back against the seat, dragging a shaking hand over his face. "You are a terrifying woman," he whispered, his voice cracking. "And you are a coward, Alistair," she said softly, dropping her hand to her lap. "You face grapeshot, but you run from a pitying look. You hired me to give you an heir. How do you propose we accomplish that if you cannot bear the touch of my hand on your face?" The words hung in the air, heavy with the reality of their contract. The unspoken clause, the reason for the marriage. Alistair looked at her, his breathing shallow. The darkness of the carriage felt entirely too small. I will not disgust you in that way. I will not subject you to my deformities in the dark." "I am not disgusted," Cecilia said, her voice dropping to a fierce, low whisper. "I am tired of pretending that a scar makes you less of a man. When you are ready to honor the terms of our contract, you know where my rooms are. Until then, do not yell at me for demanding respect for my husband." She turned away, staring out the window into the black rain, leaving him to drown in the silence. It was past 3 a.m. when the screaming started. Cecilia bolted upright in her massive, heavily draped bed. The sound was not a human cry. It was a guttural, tearing howl of absolute agony that seemed to vibrate through the very stone of Oakhaven. She threw off the covers, not bothering with a robe. She grabbed a single brass candlestick from her nightstand and ran into the freezing, drafty hallway. The screaming was coming from the east wing. Alistair's wing. She flew down the corridor, her bare feet slapping against the cold floorboards. There were no servants in sight. They had learned long ago to stay away when the Duke's nightmares came. She reached his bedroom doors. They were heavy, carved oak, and they were locked. Inside, the sound of glass shattering echoed violently, followed by a heavy, meaty thud like a body hitting the wall. "Alistair!" she yelled, pounding her fist against the wood. "Alistair, open the door!" There was only a low, frantic panting from inside, like a trapped animal. Cecilia didn't hesitate. She ran to the adjacent dressing room, knowing the adjoining doors were rarely locked. She pushed through the heavy velvet curtains, stumbling in the dark, and threw open the connecting door to his bedroom. The room was destroyed. A heavy oak washstand had been flipped over, a shattered porcelain pitcher bleeding water across the rug. A chair lay splintered near the hearth. Alistair was huddled in the far corner of the room, backed against the dark wainscoting. He was entirely naked, save for the tangled sheet twisted around his waist. He held his blackthorn cane in his right hand, swinging it wildly at empty air, his eyes wide and completely unseeing. "Hold the line!" he was screaming, his voice ragged and tearing at his throat. "God damn it, hold the line! They're coming through the smoke!" He wasn't in Yorkshire. He was back in the mud of Belgium. The phantom artillery was raining down on him. Cecilia took a step forward, the candlelight casting long, frantic shadows. "Alistair," she said, raising her voice, trying to project absolute calm. "You are at Oakhaven. You are in your home." He didn't hear her. He swung the cane violently, the heavy silver head smashing into the plaster of the wall, sending a shower of white dust over his broad, scarred shoulders. His body was covered in sweat, his chest heaving, the muscles corded tight with adrenaline. He looked terrifying. He looked dangerous. Cecilia set the candlestick down on a small side table that hadn't been destroyed. She took a deep breath, pushing the cold spike of fear deep down into her stomach. She walked directly into his line of sight, straight into the arc of the swinging cane. "Alistair, look at me." He froze. The cane stopped mid-swing. His wild, panicked, pale eye locked onto her figure in the dim light. He was breathing like a bellows, his chest rising and falling in sharp, violent jerks. "The mud," he choked out, staring at her but seeing ghosts. "It's filling the trench. They're dead! They're all dead!" "They are dead," Cecilia said, her voice hard, blunt, and completely devoid of pity. "They died 5 years ago. You did not. Put the cane down." Her harshness was a bucket of ice water. The weeping, comforting platitudes of the doctors had never worked. Her sharp, cynical reality pierced the fog of his terror. He blinked, the wildness in his eyes slowly dialed back, replaced by a horrifying, crushing wave of realization. He looked at the cane in his hand, then at the ruined room, and finally at Cecilia, standing bare-legged in a thin cotton nightgown amidst the wreckage of his mind. The cane slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly against the floorboards. He didn't fall. He just seemed to cave in on himself. He slid down the wall, his knees pulling up to his chest, hiding his face in his hands. A dry, ragged sob tore out of his throat, a sound of profound self-loathing. Cecilia walked over the shattered porcelain. She didn't kneel gracefully. She sat down hard on the damp rug right beside him, pulling her knees up to mirror his posture. The cold seeped through her thin nightgown instantly. She didn't try to touch him. She didn't stroke his hair or offer sweet, meaningless lies about everything being all right. "The artillery?" she asked quietly, resting her chin on her knees, staring straight ahead at the dead fireplace. Alistair nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion. He didn't lift his head from his hands. "I can smell the sulfur," he whispered, his voice completely broken. "I can smell the burned flesh. It never leaves the room. I smell damp wool and stale water," Cecilia said flatly. "And whatever pomade you use in your hair. Cedar, I think. No sulfur." Alistair let out a shaky, bitter laugh. He slowly lowered his hands. He turned his head to look at her. In the dim candlelight, the scars on his face were shadowed, softening the brutal edges. He looked exhausted, stripped of all his aristocratic armor. "Why aren't you running?" he asked. The rasp in his voice was thick with tears he refused to shed. "Any sane woman would run." "I am entirely insane," Cecilia replied, turning her head to meet his gaze. "And my feet are freezing. I am not running down that drafty hallway again tonight." He looked at her, truly looked at her. At the way she didn't shrink away from his naked, scarred torso, at the way she didn't treat him like a broken porcelain doll. She treated him like a man who was having a terrible night. Nothing more, nothing less. "I am broken, Cecilia," he said, the confession falling from his lips like heavy stones. "I am completely, irreparably broken, inside and out. You struck a terrible bargain." "I struck a bargain for survival," she said, her voice softening, losing the sharp, cynical edge. She unclasped her hands from her knees and reached out. Slowly, deliberately, she laid her hand over his, where it rested on his ruined, scarred thigh. He flinched, but he didn't pull away. "I don't need a whole man, Alistair," she whispered, her thumb tracing the heavy bone of his knuckles. "I need a partner who won't quit when the mud gets deep. You survived the artillery. You can survive a nightmare. Now, are you going to sit here freezing on this floor all night, or are you going to help me clean up this pitcher before the water ruins the floorboards?" Alistair looked down at her small, pale hand resting on his leg. He felt the warmth of her skin seeping into the cold, aching knot of his scars. The scent of sulfur in his nose faded, replaced by the faint, clean scent of the soap she used. Slowly, the Duke of Rothgate turned his hand over, lacing his thick, calloused fingers through hers. He gripped her hand tightly, holding on to her like a lifeline in the dark. "The floorboards are already ruined," he rasped, the ghost of a real, genuine smile touching the right corner of his mouth. "Then we shall have them replaced," Cecilia said, squeezing his hand back. "Tomorrow." The carpenters arrived at dawn. Cecilia sat at the head of the breakfast table, a ledger open next to her plate of cold eggs, listening to the rhythmic hammering echoing from the east wing. She had ordered the floorboards in Alistair's bedroom ripped out and replaced before the servants could gossip about the shattered porcelain and the blood on the wood. Alistair walked into the dining room an hour later. He did not wear his heavy coat. He wore a simple white linen shirt, open at the collar, and dark riding breeches. He looked exhausted, the shadows under his good eye bruised and deep, but the manic, cornered animal energy of the night before was gone. He sat down at the opposite end of the long table. He poured himself black coffee. He didn't look at her. "The eastern perimeter fence requires rebuilding," he said, his voice a low, gravelly scrape in the quiet room. "I'm riding out to inspect it with Harrison this morning." Cecilia slowly closed her ledger. She looked down the length of the mahogany table. It was the first time he had volunteered to leave the immediate grounds of the Abbey for estate business in 5 years. "The roads are practically liquid mud," she noted evenly. "I am aware." He took a long drink of his coffee. Finally, he lifted his head and met her gaze. His pale grey eye was startlingly clear. "You said you needed a partner who wouldn't quit when the mud got deep. I am taking you at your word." The memory of the floorboards, of his heavy, calloused hand gripping hers in the dark, flared violently between them. Cecilia felt a sudden, sharp heat rise in her chest. She ruthlessly suppressed it. "See that you wear proper boots," she said, her tone meticulously flat. "I will not spend my evening nursing you through a fever." Alistair set his cup down. The ghost of a smirk, the same one she had seen in the squalid parlour of Half Moon Street, touched the unscarred side of his mouth. "You would not nurse me, Cecilia. You would throw a blanket at my head and tell me to stop being a nuisance." "I am glad we understand each other." The dynamic in the house shifted that day. It wasn't a sudden, miraculous healing. The Duke was still a difficult, abrasive man who barked at the servants and scowled at the rain. But the invisible wall he had built between himself and the world, and more importantly between himself and his wife, had cracked. He began spending his afternoons in the estate office with her. They didn't speak of the nightmare. They fought over grain prices, crop rotation, and the exorbitant cost of imported coal. Their arguments were fierce, entirely devoid of polite, aristocratic deference, and fiercely productive. One evening, 3 weeks after the incident in his bedroom, they were sitting in the library. The fire was roaring, pushing the oppressive dampness out of the room. Cecilia was reading a letter from her aunt, ignoring Louisa's thinly veiled demands for more pocket money. Alistair was sitting across from her, a glass of brandy in his hand. He hadn't touched it. He was watching her. Cecilia felt the weight of his stare. It wasn't the hostile, defensive glare she was used to. It was heavy, evaluating, and intensely physical. She lowered the letter. "Is there ink on my nose, Your Grace?" Alistair didn't smile. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. The firelight played across his face, throwing the jagged landscape of his scars into stark relief. He didn't turn his head to hide it. "We have a contract," he said quietly. The air in the library suddenly felt very thin. Cecilia folded the letter, making sure the creases were perfectly straight. "We do. I promised you an heir," he continued, his voice dropping an octave, losing the harsh rasp and becoming something terrifyingly intimate. "And I promised I would not demand your affection. But I will not come to your bed in the dark like a thief, Cecilia. I will not hide from you under the covers, and I will not allow you to close your eyes and pretend I am someone else." Cecilia's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked at his broad chest, at the sheer physical power of the man. and then at the ruined left side of his face. She felt no revulsion. She only felt a raw, pulling gravity. She stood up. She tossed her aunt's letter into the fire and watched the paper curl and blacken. She turned to him. "I do not close my eyes to reality, Alistair. I never have." She smoothed the front of her skirt. Her hands were trembling slightly, but her voice was iron. "My rooms are at the end of the west corridor. I expect you in an hour. Leave the candles burning." She walked out of the library, leaving him staring at the fire. He came to her exactly an hour later. Cecilia was sitting on the edge of her massive bed, wearing a simple linen nightgown. She hadn't braided her hair. It hung loose over her shoulders. 3 thick wax candles burned on the dresser, casting a warm, unflinching light across the room. The heavy door opened with a click. Alistair stepped inside, closing and locking it behind him. He wore a dark silk robe, tied loosely at the waist. He leaned on his blackthorn cane, his knuckles white. The fear radiating from him was palpable. It wasn't the terror of the artillery, it was the absolute dread of disgust. He stopped a few feet from the bed. He looked at her, his jaw clamped so tight a muscle ticked rapidly in his good cheek. "If you change your mind," he rasped, staring fixedly at the floorboards. "You have only to say the word. I will leave. The contract be damned." Cecilia stood up. The floor was cold beneath her bare feet. She closed the distance between them. "Look at me," she ordered gently. Alistair slowly raised his head. His eye was entirely unguarded, stripping away the title, the wealth, and the arrogance. He was just a man, terrified of the light. Cecilia reached out. She didn't hesitate, and she didn't move slowly. She placed both her hands flat against his chest. His heart was thundering beneath her palms. "I am not pretending," she whispered, echoing the words she had spoken in the Cavendish House library months ago. She slid her hands up, over his shoulders, and cupped his face. Her left hand rested over his smooth, unblemished skin. Her right hand pressed firmly against the ruined, melted flesh of his scar. Alistair let out a ragged, shaking breath. His eyes fluttered shut. He didn't pull away. He leaned into her touch, a man dying of thirst finally tasting water. He dropped his cane. It hit the floor with a clatter. His heavy arms came around her, pulling her flush against his chest. His grip was almost bruising, desperate and possessive. There was no flowery romance. There were no whispered poems. It was a collision. He kissed her fiercely, his mouth rough and demanding. Cecilia kissed him back with equal ferocity, her hands tangling in his thick hair. She felt the heavy muscles of his back tense under his robe. He tasted of brandy and black tea. When he pulled away, he was breathing hard. He looked down at her, his gaze sweeping over her flushed face. Slowly, with agonizing hesitation, he reached for the ribbon tying the front of his robe. He parted the silk, letting it slide off his massive shoulders to pool on the floor. Cecilia didn't look away. His chest and abdomen were corded with muscle, but the left side of his torso was a continuation of the violence on his face. Jagged, shiny keloids tore across his ribs and disappeared beneath the waistband of his breeches. A deep, circular indentation marred his left shoulder, where a piece of shrapnel had been dug out. The damage to his thigh, the reason for his brutal limp, was heavily scarred and uneven. He stood naked before her in the candlelight, waiting for the verdict. Cecilia reached out and traced the deep scar on his shoulder with her fingertips. "You survived," she said, her voice thick with emotion she rarely let herself feel. "That is all I see, Alistair. I see a man who refused to die." A shudder ripped through him. He pulled her against him again, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He swept her up into his arms, ignoring the protest of his ruined leg, and carried her to the bed. The consummation of their marriage was not gentle. It was built on months of suppressed hostility, fear, and a desperate, clawing need to feel alive. He was a massive man, powerful and deeply wounded, but he treated her not as fragile glass, but as an anchor. When the pain of her innocence breaking caused her to gasp and tense, he stopped instantly. He held himself above her, his muscles vibrating with the effort of restraint, his face a mask of concern. "Cecilia!" he ground out, his voice hoarse. She opened her eyes, meeting his intense, panicked gaze. She reached up, digging her nails lightly into the heavy muscle of his shoulders. She arched her back, pulling him down, forcing the connection deeper. "Do not stop!" she ordered, her voice a fierce whisper. "Do not treat me like I am weak." He groaned, a deeply animal sound, and gave over to the gravity. In the aftermath, the candles burned down to stubs. The room was cold, but beneath the heavy down quilt, they were burning. Cecilia lay with her head resting on Alistair's scarred chest, listening to the steady, strong rhythm of his heart. His large hand was stroking the length of her spine, a slow, grounding movement. "You are a terrifying woman," he murmured into the darkness. "You have mentioned that," she replied softly, tracing a lazy circle over his ribs. "I meant it as a compliment." He kissed the top of her head. "I have spent 5 years believing I was a monster. It took a woman with ice in her veins to prove me wrong. I am not entirely ice," she said, shifting her leg over his. His hand stopped moving. He let out a low, rough chuckle that vibrated against her cheek. "No," he agreed, his grip tightening on her waist. "You are not." The spring thaw arrived with a vengeance. The frozen mud turned into rivers, and the estate burst into chaotic, demanding life. Cecilia was in the office, ankle-deep in ledgers regarding the spring planting, when Harrison knocked timidly on the door. He held a silver tray with a single, heavily sealed letter. "From London, Your Grace, addressed to the Duke." Cecilia took the heavy parchment. She recognized the crest pressed into the red wax. It belonged to Alistair's cousin, Charles, the insufferable heir presumptive, who had been patiently waiting for Alistair to drink himself to death. She carried the letter down the hall to the library. Alistair was at his desk, reviewing the architectural plans for the new village schoolhouse she had bullied him into funding. He looked up as she entered. The change in him over the last 3 months was subtle but profound. The violent tension in his jaw had eased. He still rarely smiled, but the haunted, cornered look in his grey eye had vanished. He occupied space differently now, not as a defensive fortress, but as a man who owned the ground he stood on. Cecilia dropped the letter onto the plans. Alistair glanced at the seal. His expression flattened. He picked up his silver letter opener, slit the wax, and read the brief contents in silence. He let out a short, cynical bark of laughter. He tossed the letter onto the desk. "Charles is offering his condolences," Alistair said, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. Cecilia frowned, sitting in the leather chair opposite him. "Condolences for what?" "For my continued failure to produce an heir. He has graciously offered to visit Oakhaven next month to assist with the burden of the estate, as he feels my physical limitations must be taking a terrible toll on my faculties." Alistair's voice was dry, dripping with contempt. "He smells blood in the water. He thinks our marriage is a sham to hide my inevitable collapse." Cecilia stared at the letter. A cold, familiar anger coiled in her stomach. Charles was the exact kind of titled vulture she had spent her whole life avoiding in London. "I'll write him back," Cecilia said smoothly. "Tell him the guest wing is currently undergoing renovations to repair dry rot. The Abbey is unfit for visitors." Alistair looked at her. He didn't pick up a pen. Instead, he reached out, picked up the letter, and held it over the candle burning on his desk. He let the corner catch fire, watching the parchment curl and blacken until the flames licked dangerously close to his fingers. He dropped the burning remnants into the brass ashtray. "No," Alistair said quietly. Cecilia raised an eyebrow. "You want that parasite in our home?" "He is not coming to our home," Alistair replied. He leaned forward, resting his hands flat on the desk. "We are going to his..." Cecilia froze. "London? The season is beginning." Alistair said. He wasn't looking at the ashes. He was looking directly at her. The Tun believes I am a rotting corpse hiding in a cave. They believe you are a desperate spinster I purchased to balance my books. I am entirely sick of the rumors, Cecilia. I am sick of the shadows. Cecilia's heart beat a frantic rhythm. Returning to London meant walking back into the viper's pit. It meant the staring, the whispers behind fans, the cruel caricatures in the morning papers. Alistair, she said softly. They will be merciless. The society hostesses are brutal. They will not look away from your face. I do not care where they look, he stated, his voice a low, immovable force. Let them stare. Let them whisper. I survived grape shot. I can survive Lord Linwood and a room full of over-powdered gossips. But I will not allow my cousin to circle my estate like a vulture waiting for me to die. He stood up. He grabbed his blackthorn cane, though he leaned on it far less heavily than he used to. He walked around the desk and stood before her. We leave in a week, he said. He reached down and took her hand, his thumb brushing over the simple gold band on her finger. We will attend the opening ball at Almack's. We will walk through the front doors. We will dance the first waltz, and we will remind London exactly who holds the power. Cecilia looked up at the towering, scarred man before her. The monster of Mayfair was dead. In his place stood the Duke of Rothgate, forged in fire and anchored by iron. She stood up, her hand still resting in his. The cynical, exhausted spinster who had hidden behind a pillar at Cavendish House was gone too. She had traded a life of quiet desperation for a partnership forged in mud, ledgers, and raw, unflinching truths. She looked at the ruined side of his face, then met his pale grey eye, her chin lifting in that familiar, resolute tilt. Then we had better send for the tailor, Your Grace, Cecilia said, a slow, dangerous smile finally breaking across her face. If we are going to war with London, I refuse to do it in last season's silk. Alistair let out a rough, genuine laugh. He pulled her against his chest, kissing her with a fierce, possessive pride. They were not a fairy tale. They were a fortress, and heaven help anyone who tried to breach their walls. And that is how the monster of Mayfair and the spinster of Half Moon Street forged an empire out of ruin. They didn't need poetry. They needed a partner who wouldn't flinch when the world got ugly. If this grounded, gritty take on Regency romance kept you hooked to the very last page, show your support. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story, and share this video with a friend who loves historical drama with real bite. Drop a comment below. Would you have the courage to walk back into London society by Alistair's side? Until next time, keep reading.